Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Smith, and I am the Data Governance and Ethics Lead at the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and we are proud to support this important workshop series. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's session on ethically sharing qualitative data. Qualitative data, due to its nature, presents distinct challenges to de-identification. It often contains narratives, nuanced descriptions, personal stories, and contextually rich information that may make anonymization or de-identification quite complex. Removing identifying details while preserving the integrity and meaningfulness of the data can be an intricate process. To help us maintain the delicate balance between preserving the richness of data and protecting participant privacy, we are privileged to be joined by today's presenter, Dr. Sebastian Karcher, who will share his expertise on this complex and important topic. Dr. Karcher is the Associate Director of the Qualitative Data Repository and Research Assistant Professor of Political Science at Syracuse University. His main interests are in research transparency, management and curation of qualitative data, and the integration of technology into scholarly workflows. He is an active contributor to several scholarly open source projects, teaches on digital technology and data management, publishes widely in social science journals and information science journals, and has been supported by the National Science Foundation, the Institute for Museum and Library Services, and the Sloan Foundation. Please join me in welcoming Sebastian Karcher. Sebastian, the digital floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for that kind introduction. And thank you so much, McGill, for having me. It's also, I saw some of the participants. It's great to see so many people. It's great to see some familiar, not faces, but names there. So welcome, everyone. I think Biru is going to close off with this, but I actually want to lead off by saying that this is part of a twofer. You'll get another workshop like this on Thursday by a team at Washington University and ICPSR that I very warmly recommend you all attend if you at all can. They also have just published an article in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science on many of the topics that I'm going to touch upon today. I'm going to put the link in the chat for you to all peruse, and I very strongly recommend you check out that article if you're interested in this topic. What I'm going to talk about today is more broadly approaches to ethically sharing qualitative data. I'm going to emphasize de-identification, as Victoria alluded to, but I'm going to try to paint a broader picture for you because de-identification doesn't exist in a vacuum. It interacts with various other parts that we do as ethical qualitative researchers. Because sharing qualitative data is am I sharing my screen? Let me see.
Yes.
Wonderful. I thought I should see a green frame around it. Because sharing qualitative data is newer for many people, I thought I'd start out with some examples of data that we have at the Qualitative Data Repository. So here is an example of very rich multi-method ecological data. It's a project on seed systems in West Africa, so broadly environmental agricultural science. The project has, you can see, semi-structured interviews. It has focus groups. It has a kind of drawn maps that were created as part of the focus group. It also has some simple quantitative data, right? This matches the farmers with rainfall in the region. So broad picture with multiple different sources. And we see this a lot in qualitative data that often it is multi-method data, both multi-method within qualitative work, but also multi-method by combining qualitative and quantitative work. This is an example from Lisa Wedin's book on authoritarianism and resistance in Syria. She's an ethnographer and works really on cultural ethnography, and was very interested in the use of culture and satire. So with some support from the National Science Foundation, she was able to get the rights to a couple of the Syrian sitcoms she discusses at length, got them subtitles and translated, and so we're able to share that. She also uses a wealth of online sources, and we helped her make sure that all the sources that she uses remain available via PermaCC link archiving service, especially as you're working on non-Western newspaper sources. You see some blogs in here, those sorts of things. They often go down and then disappear and make the sources underlying research unreachable. Another area that we see a lot in qualitative data is archival data. That actually is often not de-identified. What you see here are some of the letters from the archive of the Supreme Court of the United States, which a large part is at the Library of Congress in the US. You see here a letter from Antonin Scalia to Harry Blackmun, and a letter, I think, from Blackmun back to Scalia, dear Nino. It's a project by Matt Hill, and again, comes with, in this case, actually quite extensive survey quantitative data that he collected for his book on decision making in the US Supreme Court. And finally, another case of de-identified data. So this again is mostly semi-structured interviews. They're part of a more ethnographic project. They're also part of more sensitive data. So these are data on by Corey Steimer on a court diversion program for sex workers. And so people who did engage in illegal activity. It dates some years back, and she was very careful with both consent and with de-identification, but nevertheless, those data are under controlled access at QDR. And so you need to apply for access, but we do have people regularly doing this. And so these data, in spite of the access controls that they're under, are seeing a fair amount of reuse. Okay, so we've seen the examples, but why? Why share qualitative data? The reasons are really not that different than the reasons we want to share quantitative data. The first one is you want to be a good colleague. It allows others to scrutinize your data, but perhaps more importantly, to build on your work more effectively. For what we are seeing of reuse, perhaps the single most important reason and the widest reuse that we see of our holdings and that other repositories that have qualitative data see is pedagogy. We get a lot of requests from professors who want to use realistic data in teaching the next generation of qualitative researchers. And by making data available, you support better teaching and qualitative methods. Open science, and there's a fair number of studies on that, is also more impactful science. By sharing your data, you make stronger research, but you also make more impactful research that's more likely to reach decision makers and become part of decision making. Finally, these were the carrots. There is in most places a stick. Journals increasingly have requirements for some degree of data sharing, and scientific funders more and more often require some attention to data sharing, often with, and again, we can talk about this in more detail later, great respect for the ethical challenges and imperatives involved, but nevertheless, it's something that as a qualitative researcher, you're very, very likely to come into contact with. Let's give you a couple of examples of how these data are not just getting deposited, I've shown you that, but also getting reused. So this was during the pandemic, right? Master students working in a relatively short time window, and without the ability to conduct traditional fieldwork, turned to creative other solutions. And so Marina Hamdan found Corey Steimer's data and focused her master's thesis at WVU on a reanalysis of that data. Corey was delighted. Marina was delighted and able to write her master's in the middle of empirically in the middle of a pandemic. So that's kind of one of the great success stories of what shared qualitative data allows people to do. Another really interesting example is a special issue that Jessica Lester and colleagues put together for TQR. By the way, the slides are getting shared under the same license as the recordings, so the links that I have on all the slides you'll have access to later. What they did is they asked a number of teams to reanalyze the same qualitative data set, a set of three transcripts from extended focus groups with traditional birth attendants, mothers, and midwives in Nigeria, and analyze these using different methodologies. And they came out with really fascinating different views of the data that showcase both, okay, this is what these methodologies can do, but they also show how rich a relatively small qualitative data set is, and what it allows you to do when it is shared. And then finally, as I mentioned, teaching is just a huge aspect of what we do. This is a recurring course at Cardiff Metropolitan University in Wales. And every year they have more than 100 students register for QDR, access the data, practice thematic analysis. And we're really tremendously excited that that's how the data is getting used. And I mentioned this also, right? It's not a traditional way that we measure impact of our scholarship, but over the 6-7 years that they've been doing that, this data set has been downloaded just for this course more than 1,000 times. That's a type of impact that very few of our publications can hope for. All right, I've hopefully convinced you that there's a lot of data out there. It's rich, it's fascinating, and sharing it can have tremendous impact. But we still need to do so ethically. And as Victoria alluded to, there is some particular challenges in sharing qualitative research. And I could give a whole seminar on the ethics of qualitative research, and there's a rich literature on this. And so these are just kind of some of the highlights that I wanted to pick out. Qualitative research is particularly relational. And that applies in two ways. On the first level, it's more relational than many quantitative approaches, in that the researcher, just by collecting materials and data, interacts directly with a participant, forms often personal relationships with them. And so the interchange of information is much more relational. But then also the analysis is often more relational, in that its data are often treated through the lens of the researcher. They're interpreted. The researcher becomes part of the story, depending on your methods to different degrees, but some level of explicit interpretation, labels such as positionality, reflexivity, you'll have heard, play an important role. And that also means that the epistemological commitments may be more complex. Whereas a lot of quantitative research is, broadly speaking, positivist, right? You're trying to establish facts and towards kind of more or less law-like relationships. Qualitative research tends to be more interpretive, trying to understand meaning of things, emphasizing different possibilities of interpretation. sometimes also with a explicit normative commitment, right? Think of action research, those sorts of things. And that makes some of the ethics of sharing data particularly complex. I won't be able to solve all of these issues for you today. There are indeed complex issues, but I do want you to kind of, as you listen to me, be aware of these complexities. And data sharing for qualitative research is discussed quite controversially in many disciplines, and it's important to remain aware of kind of all the different layers of what's going on. But on a more pragmatic level, there are still kind of fairly straightforward steps, and that's what I'll talk you through and discuss with you over the next hour and 20 minutes. So as you think about sharing qualitative data, right, you start out by considering what are you going to collect, right? What maybe should you not collect in the first place? How are you going to collect it? What's the right way to collect data? Recording, not recording, modes of consent, etc. You will want to consent directly and explicitly for data sharing, and we'll talk about this in some more detail. Especially as you're doing field-based research, but also in general, you want to manage your materials securely. And securely, I mean two aspects. A, you want to make sure you don't lose them, because that'd be a huge waste of your participants and your time. But you also, of course, want to protect the data against unauthorized access. In many, but not all cases, but most cases that we're going to talk about today, you will have promised de-identification. So you will need to de-identify the data as promised. And in many cases, and I gave you one example for that earlier on, you will still want to control access to the data for a variety of reasons. And then I'll briefly touch on additional considerations that you may want to pay attention to if you're doing research on particular groups of participants, or with particular groups of participants. There's vulnerable groups, right? Children, prisoners, those sorts of things. It's also and a very prominent topic in Canada, of course, research with First Nations and other Indigenous groups. So the first thing I want to mention is that you don't always need to collect all sorts of information. So focus groups, very prominent, especially in medical research. And oftentimes these are one-shot events. You typically don't expect to recontact participants in focus groups beyond their identity that sampled them into the focus group. So say they were patients or caregivers or medical personnel, their specific identity doesn't matter. They won't be reflected beyond that in the focus group transcript. So you don't necessarily need to even collect the specific identity of focus group participants. That makes a lot of things easier for you later on. It means the data are much easier to protect and secure, all those sorts of things. If there are legal issues, right, there are issues of subpoenas depending on the type of data that you collect. If you can say, I never had this information, I never knew their actual last name, you protect yourself and you protect your participants. Obviously, that's not always possible, right? Like oftentimes, we specifically solicit people to interview with their contact information, or we may want to conduct multiple interviews, or at least keep the possibility of conducting multiple interviews open. And in that case, of course, you do want to keep that information. More on that in a bit. Especially if you go that route, if you want to be careful about what you collect. Obviously, science study information sheets are one of the ways in which you collect identifiable information. And both for that and for other reasons, they may not always be appropriate. Both Canadian research ethics boards and US IRBs, those are the systems I know best. Sorry for people from other places, legal ethical institutions around this vary a bit. So these are the two that I'm going to cover. They both allow for oral consent when it is appropriate, both culturally and given the topic. You do need to document, of course, exactly how you're going to do this. And there's often good ways of kind of keeping a record that consent was given. So one thing that we often advise people is to start the recording post-consent with a statement like, we've talked about the consent and you've consented to being in this study. And then, there's some sort of nod or affirmation or so. So you have a record that informed consent is given without having the whole informed consent procedure and potentially identifiable information on the recorded interview. If you are collecting identifying information, and this is typically standard procedure and required by your IRB/REB, obviously you want to store that very securely, ideally in a separately encrypted file and separately from any recording transcript. So if you need to be able to re-identify transcript, right, have that re-identification key really secure. Typically, I tell people encrypt the file individually, like an Excel file, you can just encrypt in Excel proper, for example, and then store it on a different cloud service or whatever you use to securely store your data. Especially when you do fieldwork-based research, and I've done some research on this, researchers are often kind of making things up as they go because we don't receive good training for that. Try to plan as much as you can for security, both in the sense of preventing people to get a hold of your data, but also for, how, for example, are you able to get good backups while you're in a place that maybe doesn't have good internet, those sorts of things. So think about this, talk to people at your institution and beyond, talk to people on the ground, say journalists, those sorts of things, to make sure that data are secure. And just to bring this back to our topic of ethical sharing, right, if you don't protect your data in the field, they get lost, you can't share them, but also if the wrong people get a hold of your data while you're collecting them, all your efforts about ethical sharing are in vain because the wrong people already have a hold of your data. Informed consent has become a staple of social science research. It's actually, there are debates about, its status within qualitative research, especially if you do more embedded research like ethnography that I'm not going to touch much on today, but I want to flag that there are debates about, is this too transactional for the relational nature of some qualitative work? But it is the legal framework in which we all are operating. So as you do use informed consent, explicitly ask consent for data sharing. Now, depending on the population you're talking to, that may look different. I do a lot of research on research. So I talk to other researchers, and there I can use fairly technical language, right? I can say things like, I'll share the de-identified transcripts through a data repository, and it makes sense to my participants. In many other cases, that would be useless as informed consent because people don't know what a data repository is. The identification might not be a word that they understand very well. So think about what's appropriate language that conveys the idea of data sharing, but actually it informs at a level where your participants are able to follow what you mean. Ideally, if at all possible, try to test that. If you're doing some piloting or so, that might be a good place to talk through some options for language. Another thing that we found is that a lot of qualitative researchers assume a certain view of data sharing by their participants. And one of the messages that I want to convey today is don't. On average, for the relatively limited number of studies that we have, participants appear to be more interested or more open to data sharing than many of their the researchers collecting the data originally assumed. That said, that doesn't mean you should assume they're open to data sharing, because you may find specific subgroups, for example, groups that have had negative experiences with researchers or negative experiences with researchers of your background in the past, and may very much not be open, which is why it's important to ask. One thing that we often advocate at QDR, and we've seen good results with, is opt-in consent. Sometimes that's referred to as tier consent for data sharing. So you opt in people into your study first, and then you separately ask, and can we share the data? The advantage here is twofold. For one, you don't sort out people who are opposed to data sharing for some reasons, who may be particularly valuable informants in your study, because you obligate them to share the data, and then they may just opt out of the study entirely. So it keeps people in your study and prevents bias, all those sorts of things. It's also on an ethical level and gives people more agency about what they want to happen with their information. I believe GDPR may arguably require it. No one really knows what GDPR requires of research, but it's certainly in the spirit of empowering people to manage and to be empowered to determine what happens with their data. Again, I won't be able to do full justice to the complex topic of Indigenous First Nations data, but just to flag that consent can become more complex when you're working particularly with Indigenous groups. And in addition to individual level consent, you will often need to consent the right community via elders, via council, via other community organization. It's highly context dependent. You need to know kind of the groups you're talking to. You need to know their legal statutes, as well as the legal statutes covering that type of research in your area. But again, important to keep in mind that our traditional, only the person you do research with is in charge of giving consent does not apply in all contexts. All right, examples. So this is a study by two researchers at the Guttmacher Institute in the US. Guttmacher Institute conducts research on reproductive health and abortion. And this was a study doing cognitive interviews to improve measurements of abortion in surveys. So the cognitive interviews is the qualitative part of the study. They interviewed participants in Wisconsin and New Jersey. Half of them had had abortions and half of them hadn't, and built in opt-in consent, as I discussed. Right? If you agree, the transcript of your interview may be shared with researchers at other organizations in the future. So that's the data sharing part at a fairly simple level. Second part, we will take out or change any information that could identify you before sharing. That's the de-identification part. Again, very nice, simple language. You can be in the study whether you agree to data sharing or not. Again, they make it optional. They make it clear you can still be in the study. And then after the consent to participate, they have the optional consent to data sharing, the yes/no question. And so given what I told you about the study, and if you haven't already clicked through or know the study, why don't you give me an estimate in the chat? What percentage of participants you think opted into data sharing. All right. And seeing numbers, lots of 50s, going as low as 40, bunch of numbers, someone in the 30s, a lot of 70, 80, thank you. So people relatively optimistic and for good reason. 92% of respondents opted into data sharing, so very high percentage. That squares with, again, we don't have a ton of information about it, but there are some other studies. There are some interesting, slightly newer studies by Susan Campbell and team that ask even more vulnerable group. Sexual trauma survivors, and got even higher opt-in to data sharing. So the finding does seem to hold up, at least in the US and Western context. Don't assume that the same is true for necessarily all other contexts. Another thing that I want to flag in the study, in spite of them working quite hard to craft the consent language, when they followed up to make sure that people actually knew what they were getting into, they found a lot of people where they weren't sure they actually had fully understood what data sharing would entail. And you can find more in the paper. Danica linked that in the chat. Thank you for that. So we kind of need to figure out how we make sure that people are actually informed about the consent they're giving. If you have specific questions, again, say about visual data, etc., please do use the Q&A feature for those. I won't be able to go through the chat in a kind of unstructured way. All right. So this is the anonymization workshop. You'll notice I avoid talking about anonymization like the plague. There's two reasons. A, in some contexts, anonymization means a specific legal thing. So, for example, if you're in the EU, GDPR specifies anonymization as a very specific process that we often cannot achieve with qualitative data. The second thing is that anonymization evokes this idea that we can guarantee people that the data are actually anonymous. There are no mathematical ways of doing this for qualitative data, certainly. So most of the people who work on qualitative data prefer to use de-identification throughout. De-identification in qualitative research is also kind of a bit of an art as much as science. And I often show these two images to give you examples of how this is a balance between two extremes. So on the left, you see this excerpt from, this is from one of the early cases, actually not against Trump, but against Michael Cohen, his former attorney, on approximately June 16, 2015, individual one, for whom Cohen worked at the time, began an ultimately successful campaign for president of the United States. I think we can all agree that the individual one is not actually in any way helpfully de-identified here. On the other side, you have something that you get in response to a fair amount of freedom of information requests in the US. You get the beginning of a letter and then everything is blacked out, which admittedly, very effective de-identification, but also completely useless. So that's kind of the two extremes you're moving in between of. So let's just talk some basics. We often talk about direct and indirect identifiers, right? A direct identifier is a piece of information that by itself is enough to identify someone. So that's their home address, say their phone number, their first and last name, those sorts of things. obviously remove those and replace them with pseudonyms. Very often you don't need them typically. We generally recommend that you do not blank out things. It reads terribly. It also, if you just put black bars upon it, the length of something may actually be a clue towards re-identification. So actively replace it either with pseudonyms or with replacements like interviewee one or something like that. Just a flag that someone says not everyone has access to the Q&A. I don't know if that's something that organizers can help with. In many cases, indirect identifiers, right? If I know too much detailed information about you, if I know when you graduated high school, where you graduated high school, what profession you have, I can likely identify you. Those are indirect identifiers. Very often I can keep some of that information by making it less precise. So instead of saying I was born in 1937, I can do something like born in 1930 to 1940. Very specific profession can be turned into less specific profession and still be valuable, rich information that keeps the data usable for most purposes. You always lose something, right? Like 1932 and 1937, very much not the same thing, right? Like if I think about, right, my parents were born in 1938, they were 6 when the war in Europe ended. Someone who was born, so they, for example, right, me being German, they were never part of the Hitler Youth, those sorts of things. Someone born in 1932 would very much have gone through that system. It's not the same thing. You always lose some information, but you're still able to share that and share the data at least and keep some of the richness intact. Indirect identifiers also interact with each other, right? If you remove one piece of information or redact it very broadly, that affects how identifying another piece of information is. Say, for example, if you don't tell people the city someone was born in, giving people a more precise year or more precise profession may be possible, and vice versa, right? If you make the group of people something can apply to larger in one set, you can restrict it in another set and still have kind of a large enough amount of people a transcript could be applying to. Also, de-identification applies to interacts with who has access to the data. So if, and this comes up a fair amount, if I know a population, subpopulation really well, right, if you do research in a small community, even if you take out all ostensibly identifying information, neighbors are likely going to be able to identify people. And by controlling access to the data, by filtering, okay, these people cannot have access to the data, or you need to go through certain checks. Maybe you need to be a researcher. Maybe you'll have to, if the data remains identifiable, pass your own REB or IRB. In those sorts of situations, you can help de-identification by restricting who has access to the data. Before we get into doing some de-identification ourselves, I'm gonna go through some of the questions in Q&A so that we let's sort them. Yes. Yeah, so this is a great question at the top. So this is about if someone opts out of data sharing but still participates in a study, how exactly can their data be used and what results can be shared? So the informed consent script typically has language about how information can be used. Often you see such language like your data will only be used in the aggregate or something like that. You can typically use short excerpts, all those sorts of things. You can certainly use people's answers to inform, say, your thematic analysis. What you can't do is share the whole de-identified transcripts. One reason why I advise against doing opt-in research for opt-in consent for data sharing for quantitative studies is that it messes up your quantitative computational reproducibility of data, right? Because you will have to remove those rows from the shared public data set, which means, but you can use those rows in your analysis for your article, but that means your article isn't computationally reproducible. So don't do it for quant, essentially, is what I'd say. That I think that hopefully gives you kind of a sense of what you can do. So you can use them in all your analysis. You can typically use short quotes. You can absolutely not share the full transcripts or any other relevant kind of full larger data that or richer data that they gave you. More on the informed consent script from Jessica. Regarding the informed consent text, would you ever suggest giving a bit more detail about what the identification will entail? Saying just take out or change can be a bit vague. I would generally be careful with giving too much information in informed consent scripts for two reasons. There is this idea, the more information we give people, the more informed they are. But that is not actually how that works. If we make our informed consent scripts too long and provide every conceivable bit of information in there, they become less informative because they become 4 pages of a single space text that no one will ever read. So you need to think about, how can you get the relevant information in front of people? What you can do, and what, for example, Susan Campbell, who I mentioned, did with their participants, is offer participants the opportunity to review de-identified transcripts and remove any additional information they think shouldn't be in there. So if that becomes a concern, and again, don't overestimate how much people actually want to do this, but it has very little cost for you to make that offer and say, if you want to review my de-identification, I'm happy to send you transcripts. You can see if there's anything remaining that you're concerned about, and then do that. All right. Some of the questions I'm going to keep for later. Serge asked, were subjects compensated? Was opt-in mandatory? So that's kind of the cool thing about the opt-in. This was a compensated study, but the opt-in for data sharing had no effect on compensation. And that's kind of the cool feature of the opt-in research, right? You don't force people's hand, kind of, if you want to be in the study, if you want that compensation, you have to share your data. So it's not undue pressure. In spite of that, people are likely to do it. And the reasons people are often given is that they have no concerns. They trust kind of that the researchers are careful with the data. They're happy to see that information used by other scientists. There's a lot of, I want to help science, even in studies where people's partial reason for participating is that they are compensated. Right, that's a follow-up to the question of what to do when you have some people not opting in. So when confronted with a scenario in which certain research participants have declined to share their data while others have provided their consent, and you share the data of those who have consented, How do you report this in a data repository? And how can this affect the reproducibility of your research? Two different questions. The first part is you report it in the data repository, right? So one thing that we tell people at QDR is that your data description needs to include both what you share, but also what you not share and why. In some cases, there is a whole family of information that you can share for whatever ethical reasons. In some cases, you have something like the opt-out, where you say some participants opted out. If you can provide additional context. So for example, in the study that I cited, there was no obvious difference between the people who opted out and who opted in. So about, I think it was like total of 6 opt-outs, something like that. 3 of them had an abortion, 3 hadn't, about equal numbers in both states. So there wasn't something that stood out that certain types of people were super more likely to opt out of data sharing. If you can provide that information, like anything that will help reusers contextualize what data they're getting in comparison to what you were able to analyze for the original study is helpful. And then in terms of reproducibility, most qualitative methods aren't intended to be computationally reproducible. If, again, some of your thematic findings really hinge on participants that opted out of data sharing or didn't opt into data sharing, you need to report that in the data description. But that is what it is. And the nice thing is that other qualitative researchers will understand that and will also respect the ethics behind doing that. So you're doing the best that you can. I would suspect in most cases that's not how things play out. Most of the time, the kind of who opts in and who opts out will be more random, and you'll still be able to get similar themes, topics, etc. from the shared data. But as more people do this, we'll have more information on that, and we'll maybe have to develop more sophisticated reporting on what we do if this strongly affects the qualitative finding. Again, for quantitative research, it's a different topic. And generally, if you can avoid it, the identification is easier, the relationship is less close, the data tends to be less rich. If you can avoid it, don't do opt-in consent for quant studies. All right, let me take maybe one more. Right, so there's a comment that someone posted, I think Tisha just posted it here, that there are additional, right, the consent that you give. So the comment is, once researchers actually reach the stage of data sharing in a repository, they're often informed of additional hows. Can journalists use the data? Are the variables that need to be restricted to bona fide researchers? Can you follow up with participants, I guess is meant here. So while consent forms give permission to share data, PIs still need to consider the how later, and they typically do, right? Like the consent gives you kind of the ability to share the data. That doesn't mean you need to do everything that's allowed by the consent. So for example, in the case of the study, the cognitive interviews, the researchers decided to not share the transcripts from people where they felt their subsequent answers didn't reflect that they actually understood what data sharing entailed. And that was not because they legally wouldn't have been able to share it, right? People consented into it on a technical level, but they didn't feel like on an ethical level they had. So that would be one example. And other examples where you want to curtail further who has access to the data. So for example, prevent journalists from using the data by putting some sort of access restrictions on it for some sort of concerns, right? I don't know how many people are familiar with Alice Goffman's book, on the Run, right? A very highly lauded ethnography of Black youth in Philadelphia. And she actually tried to destroy all her data, but nevertheless, based on what was in the book, a journalist kind of went in and was able to identify participants in her study. I don't think that ended up harming any of the participants, but still it kind of shows the general concerns here that journalistic methods may allow a level of re-identification that you may not have predicted. So restricting who has access to the data and what you can do with that, right? Data doesn't have to necessarily be open data, even if it's in a repository. Okay, I answered that one. So 2 questions I'm taking together, and then I'm going to move on and see how much more I can take at the end. Ziyu Wang asks, does QDR have data anonymization tools in their system? We don't. The presentation on Thursday will introduce some tools that are currently not public, but hopefully will be in the future. Generally, even with those tools, there's still a fair amount of manual labor involved. We do have guidance based similar to what I've given you today, but in some more details. And then Valerie Damaret asks, and I'm translating from the French, yes, is it appropriate to put full transcripts, de-identified transcripts in a repository, or rather just short extracts? That really depends. Depends on what you want to do and what the requirements are. Generally, full transcripts are richer. Full transcripts are the only thing that can effectively be reused. But they also are easier to re-identify. They pose bigger risks. They may not have been covered by consent if you already have your study set up. So we do have a fair number of studies, particularly data sets underlying journal articles, where people have indeed just gone in and put kind of their full coding tree with 1 or 2 example citations that illustrated their coding. That's much less rich, but it's still a big step forward in terms of making your analysis understandable and, if not reproducible, at least kind of verifiable, evaluable. So no clear yes or no answer there. In general, if you can share full transcripts and you feel it's ethically appropriate, that's the way to go. But you may not feel that's the case, or you may not be able to. And in that case, extended excerpts, typically matched with qualitative coding, are still an improvement. All right. I see there's lots more questions, and I'll get to as many as I can later on. Do remember that you can vote on things in the Q&A if you really want me to get to answering something. Some other things, moving back to de-identification, some other things to pay attention to. Different disciplines and methods actually have different norms about how you de-identify. In ethnography, for example, you will often see pseudonyms, so actually different names used. In some cases, in some traditions, it may actually even be acceptable to create composite characters. So you claim a person as one person, but you actually take features from 2 people as part of the material. Also, it's less common to mark redactions, changes, etc. But especially in sociology, there's quite a debate about to what degree that's appropriate, whether not doing this actually suggests a level of factuality and certainty that you don't have in your data. Just kind of for you to be aware of it matters where you are. In other fields, so for example, if you do qualitative medical research, semi-structured interviews, using something like interviewee1, city1 is the norm and perfectly sufficient. If you do de-identification as a group, having some sort of log may be very helpful. Obviously, again, creates a security concern. So you need to think about how can you keep this safe and separate, etc. But it's the only way how you can align de-identification across a group, make sure that terms match, for example, so you can still have cross linkages across different transcripts, those sorts of things. This is time intensive. So often it makes sense to think about, can you apply this while if you transcribe yourself, or if during your initial coding, right? We often do kind of a first loose open coding on data. That might be a good place to flag things that may need or do need de-identification. I've mostly talked about de-identifying persons, and that's 90% of the time what we do. But it may also be appropriate to mask locations, certainly sacred locations, but also if you do kind of archaeological research, just archaeological sites to prevent robbery, those sorts of things, or communities. If you're working with small communities, you may want to mask the identity of the entire community and not just of the individuals within it. Okay, let's look at an example. I'm going to put that link in the chat. I was hoping to put that link in the chat. Give me 1 second. This is oral history, so this was actually not on the record interview, which is why sharing it here publicly is perfectly fine. But we're going to pretend it was not. And we want to de-identify this. You'll see kind of it starts, there's some harder parts to it and some interesting parts to it, which is why I like to use it as an exercise. It is now 11 o'clock. I say 15 minutes here, but given the amount of questions, let's maybe just take 9 minutes. So until 11:10. Go through the text and think a little bit about how would you de-identify this? What would you change? How would you change it? How do maybe things interact that you would redact? And while you do that, I'll see if I can go through some more of the many questions. Thanks for those, by the way. This is great. All right. It's 11, almost 10. Let's use the chat for that. I'll try to read as quickly as I possibly can. Starting with the first paragraph. What did people do? What did they redact? What did they maybe choose not to change? And how did you change things? Yep, that one is the straightforward ones. Obviously, Manuel Kaufman and Helen Carroll go. Second and third sentence. So that would be this segment. So name of the street, that one is one that you almost certainly want to do. Change the name of the city to Northeast City, reacted to City 1. So we're already getting to kind of one of those cases where it's quite tricky what you do, right? So do you take the city out entirely? Do you try to, is it a Northeast US city? In which case, I know you probably have it, since it's clear that it's a larger city, it's now maybe 4 cities or so that you're looking at. then change years to ranges. Do we have years here? I think they come further down. Yeah, so Michael has suggests keeping the city in and change ethnicity. Change all reference to city, neighborhood, university. You see how people are struggling, and that's one of the reasons I like this, right? People are struggling with, you know, how much do you need to take out? There is some right. Eric points out what you de-identify also depends on your research question, and that's one of the tricky things if you're de-identifying for potential reuse is that you don't know your reusers research question. My suggestion is you go by your research question because that's what you know best and that allows you to do the best job, but it's obviously not ideal. In quant, right, with differential privacy, there's this neat concept of a privacy budget that you can give people so they can kind of, depending on their research question, tweak on different corners of re-identifiability. And there are groups in Germany, there's one, they've tried to kind of build this into their de-identification, but I don't think we're anywhere close to that, unfortunately. And right, so Jessica suggests keeping religion. One thing that Kristen points out is it depends on how big that part of the city is, how many Jewish men and Irish Catholic women got married at that time. So contextual knowledge matters. That's one of the reasons we actually don't do de-identification for other people, because oftentimes you do need to know a fair amount about your data to do an effective job at de-identification. We help people, but we require that folks do it themselves. And then right, there's a nice example from Danica and the types of like broadening on categories for professions. They were both working in the public service when they got married. Changed the name of school to Catholic Schools High School by Amber. That's another nice example. Jennifer points out, you know, remove the dad's height. And remove specific injury, right? The height is kind of one of those interesting things here, because if you want to keep the sport in and then keep the height in, it becomes pretty clear that you're not talking about soccer or lacrosse. And nice example of indirect identifiers. Remove the year of the photo and where the team photo is posted, maybe say it's posted on the wall at the institution, all good examples. So I'm gonna present a partial, an option. So I did a lot of the things that people suggested. I kept both the city and the ethnicities in. That is a trade-off. We felt it was big enough to Philadelphia was big enough and there were enough Jewish and Catholic people at that time that we felt okay about it and felt just too fascinating, too important a part of the story. When I think about qualitative research, I often think about the story. Like if you take out kind of right, these are not just two ethnicities. There are two ethnicities who are kind of transitioning into whiteness at exactly that point in time in kind of US racial history. It's just too rich a piece of data for me to bear taking it out. And keeping Philadelphia, and I felt like taking UPenn out was pointless, sorry. And then I did do a fair number of the things that people described for the last paragraph. Another thing to consider is that it also somewhat depends on how worried you are about re-identification, right? Like if this is data that I really don't want de-identified, but like no one's gonna die if it gets re-identified, this would be fine. If re-identification of the data gives me nightmares, I would put this behind access controls, but I would also probably go at it a little broader. So lots of trade-offs involved in the process, and that's what I love about this piece. I'm glad people had some fun with it, that it kind of shows you all the things that are going in qualitative data. So access controls. There is this nice bon mot that I think actually the European Union managed to coin: as open as possible, as close as necessary. Right, given who is here, I assume most of you are aware of this, but just because data is in a data repository doesn't have to mean it's open data. It can be at any level of closeness. It can be, so for example, we don't put generally broad open licenses on data, on any human participant data in QDR. So our licenses don't cover commercial use, don't cover republication, those sorts of things. And then we go further with access restriction. That's actually fairly common. That's what you will see at a lot of the qualitative data repositories in Europe too. In other cases, defaulting to an open license, that's what we do for all documentation, for example, is an option. You can consider having separate data sets. That's very common for quantitative data, where you have data sets, say, without zip codes for public use. And then you have restricted use data that you can also only use under conditions in a virtual enclave, whatever have you, that has more fine-grained geographical data, and where, for example, outputs may be getting screened, or any number of the things that you can do. But obviously you can do something like that with qualitative data as well. There aren't a lot of examples of this, but having a more strongly and a more weakly de-identified data set, especially if you have a really valuable data set that has some public interest component, but also some data that you really want to keep out of too much of the public, that might be an option. Embargoes can be quite valuable, and those have, for data, typically been associated with right of first publication, and that's perfectly fine, right? You put a 1-year embargo on the data because you want to publish on it first, but you want to signal, it's here and it's going to become available in a year. But you can also, of course, use them for participant protection, and that has more of a tradition in traditional archiving, right? So lots of people who donate their papers to a physical archive will stipulate that they become accessible upon their death. 10 years after the death, for the Supreme Court justices, for example, a lot of the justices that donate their papers, which I think all do, say that you can access the papers once everyone they served on the bench with, I think, has left. That has become fairly common, which means now that the people are getting younger and younger, it takes quite some time to be able to get at the papers. But all different types of embargoes can be quite effective at protecting people. If you're thinking about Corey's work on prostitution, one of the things she said, it didn't actually have an embargo, but the fact that it was 10 years old meant that it would be much harder to track down people mentioned in the data if they're sufficiently de-identified to not be able to do much with court records. Then just time passed will help you. Similarly for things, if you work with younger people, if you work with people in a specific administration where re-identification may be less of an issue once the administration is out of power, all those sorts of things. The most common access controls are some sort of checking, and there are lots of different things that repositories do there. I mostly speak about what QDR does, but broadly speaking, this applies to repositories that take access control data. What we do quite a bit, I would say 80% of our access control data, we actually just require some basic things, right? We do an identity check, so we make sure people are who they claim they are. We require them to submit a research plan and a data security plan, and sometimes show some sort of human subjects training like CITI, etc. And the type of data where that helps us is data that is well de-identified, but where we have remaining concerns that could be identifiable by people with local knowledge. So a typical example is one of the first restricted use data sets we had are interviews with local power brokers in Argentina. They're very thoroughly de-identified, but of course they're also very long. And if you know the local politics super well, and there aren't that many of these in the Buenos Aires region, if you know the local politics really, really well, you might be able to just identify them by patterns of speak, etc. So that's one of an example. If you say, okay, if you're an Argentine journalist working in that area, you probably won't be able to get access to the data. We also, for all controlled access data, we require specific use and we require certification of data destruction of the copy of the data, obviously, by the people who get access. You can, and we occasionally do that. ICPSR does that for virtually all restricted data, require institutionally signed data use agreements. So there, it's not just a researcher who promises to do something, but actually the institution puts their signature under the application for data. That means there's a lot more leverage involved if something goes wrong. It also means that two sets of lawyers get involved, so it's a much higher bureaucratic, that's the repositories and the signing institutions lawyers, and so in some cases that takes a year. So where it's not necessary, this isn't great, but it does add another layer of security, particularly where data remain identifiable to some extent. Secondary IRBs may be warranted. So we're just about to publish, for example, materials from a diary project that has photo, video, and audio diaries from thousands of people through 2.5 years of COVID. And a lot of this is identifiable. Participants were told that that was going to be put online, but still it's identifiable human participant data. So we're going to require IRBs for access. And there are cases where it makes sense to have depositors approve access. Generally, we try to avoid that, both for fairness reasons. We don't want kind of the people whose publications may get scrutinized to be the gatekeepers of the data, but also for logistical reasons. As an institution, QDR or any other data repository kind of thinks about the long term, are we still going to be able to get hold of a depositor 10, 20, 25 years down the line? But in some cases, it's still warranted. For example, if depositors are in a particularly good position to judge whether someone maybe from a group that should not have access to data or similar concerns. There are places that use enclaves, so locked facilities, if either the virtual or the physical kind, for access to data. We do that very little at the current state. I think we'll probably see more of it going forward, but I did want to flag it here. For qualitative data, of course, people would still, if they use a virtual enclave, be able to, write down names, take pictures of their screen, whatever, those sorts of things. But accidental disclosure. So for example, you download data, which you can't in a virtual enclave, and then your laptop gets stolen, wouldn't be likely to happen. So we could protect against lots of accidental loss of data or poor data management. This is my last slide on that I at least wanted to flag. If you do research with groups with special legal status, like prisoners, children, where you think you can't provide that the ability to consent may be compromised in one way or the other, you may want to be particularly careful. Applies to other vulnerable groups too. That's a good place where if you have a good IRB or ethics board, they're great to help you think through it. Unfortunately, that's not always going to be the case. Sometimes they work more as bureaucratic than as ethical institutions. And then you need to find other people to help you, in addition to the legal requirement of the IRB, to help through this. The challenge here is, right, that just defaulting to not sharing gets you, out. Everyone is going to be fine with that, but it may not actually be in the best interest of your participants, right? If you do, say, research with prisoners or with children, they may actually be quite excited to have their voices maximally heard. So complicated, challenging situations there that have both a legal framework, but then also an additional ethical framework that you need to think through very carefully. I can't give you any blanket rules. Obviously, you need to tread very lightly, and in doubt, not publish the data in the end, but don't start out by just kind of assuming that you don't. Particularly because Canada is one of the places where people have thought most carefully about research with First Nations and other Indigenous groups. I did want to flag that here. There are specific legal requirements. They vary by where you are, right? In Canada, often institutions have their own very careful protocols for doing research with Indigenous groups. In the US, many Indigenous, but not all Indigenous groups have their own IRB that you need to pass in addition to your institution's IRB in order to do research with them. As I mentioned, you often will need some sort of community consent because a lot of knowledge, especially if you think of qualitative knowledge, is considered communal property and not just something for someone to give away, right? Just because an Indigenous person tells you and passes on a bit of information that's culturally relevant, that doesn't mean they have the right to pass that on. There's the Canadian OCAP principles that Kayla mentioned. There's internationally, there's the CARE principles, so that's collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility, ethics, that are designed to kind of build a framework that goes alongside the FAIR principles that you've probably all heard about if you're here. Findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable for data. Personally, I really like to think of data sovereignty as kind of the overarching principle here. Data sovereignty comes, I believe, originally out of New Zealand as a concept, but has been taken up really widely in the Indigenous space and gives you kind of a really clear handle if you think about, okay, the data are not the Indigenous groups, people have authority and control over what happens with their data, and that's how you're going to work with them, both as a researcher, as a repository. I think that gives you a kind of, as a general guiding framework, a very helpful idea of a first approach. And then again, there may be specific legal regulations that you want to follow, but most importantly really is the closed dialogue there. You shouldn't be doing research on Indigenous topics if you're not working closely with Indigenous interlocutors to design this as research that's in the interest of the communities in the first place. All right, with that, have various contact information there. I'm looking forward to hearing from people. And I'm seeing lots more questions. All right. In controlled sharing of qualitative data, how ethical is it to leave the decision to share in the hand of the researcher? I think I kind of answered that more or less, right? It has reasons you may want to do that, but as a repository, we try to discourage it in most cases. And most research actually are fine with being done and not also answering emails about access to their data. We only have a couple of cases where researchers really wanted to stay on involved in the data access process. Could you please add some ways to de-identify visual data that go beyond blurring of faces and removing the metadata? And how would that affect the authenticity of the data? I think that was Danica posted, if you scroll up quite a bit in this chat, a bunch of examples for neuroimaging data. So that's one sort of visual data. At some level, you need to accept that some data just can't be effectively de-identified and need to make a call of, is this data that maybe doesn't get shared or data that gets shared but under appropriate restrictions. So for example, the Databerry project is a project that was founded as a data repository, and it's a project founded by mainly developmental psychologists. So they have lots, and they specialize in video data. So they have lots of incredibly adorable videos of research with little children, where the parents have given consent for them to be used, and that all goes through IRBs. So these are institutional agreements where you only get access to the data if your IRB allows it, and we've come up with a pretty nice viable system for that. And so the access to the data there is to the raw visual data. And personally, I think something along those lines, wherever possible, is the way to do, is the way to go, trying to actually de-identify and you go blurring, and then you also need to blur the voices, and it becomes a whole mess. And how useful is the data, and how much does it have to do with the original data after you're done with it in the first place? So that's my view. Where you can share visual data, kind of share it under appropriate controls, and probably try to avoid de-identifying. I'm sure other people disagree, but that's kind of my view on this. I want to point people to Donna's question in the Q&A about the Canadian requirements for opt-in consent. I will not talk to legal rules in Canada, but some of the privacy stuff is making things right, especially the authority to control your own data, issues of broad consent, those sorts of issues are making data archiving quite challenging. So that was Donna's question. How do you approach working with researchers who want to make their data public because they are retiring, cementing their legacy or so on? Sometimes it can be an ethical can of worms. Yeah, so we have, and repositories vary slightly on this, but we at QDR have relatively strict norms on kind of how we approach data without consent. So if the consent was very clear that the data was not going to be shared, so you find a lot of only I will have access to the data, or data will be destroyed, all those sorts of things. We just don't accept your data, and we're sometimes very sad about this, but it's the right thing to do, even if the data are de-identified. There are other cases, right, when the data may be silent on the topic, and then we have longer conversation with with the depositors. We tried to see if there was maybe a sense of what participants expected. We also look at sensitivity. Can we do restricted access for data under unclear consent? So there are kind of gray areas where we try our best together with the depositor to make ethical judgment calls, where, obviously, given the nature of that process, the highest ethical denominator wins. But that all said, I think legacy data is incredibly rich and incredibly valuable. So trying to help researchers think through this early enough, right, is a great way to go about. So that doesn't help us now, right? If someone retires now, they certainly didn't ask for data sharing in their research 25 years ago, but it is something that will get better. And so those are some of kind of the considerations that we play with. And then, of course, not all data are human participants data, right? Some legacy data that we have are just archival scans that are really cool and would be really hard to come by otherwise. And the archives are okay with it, and we are happy to have them online, and that's great. So there are the easy cases, and that I guess would be the other message. Don't let the hard cases deter you from archiving the lower hanging fruit, that much of which still isn't getting archived. Are there emerging considerations for the capabilities of AI to de-identify based on published data as an input? Not that I know of. My sense would be, right, AI needs training data, so that would be most relevant for elite interviews. And I could very much see that you wouldn't be able to share elite interviews as de-identified anymore, because AI would be able to tell the speaker, right? Like famously, one of the much pre-AI, one of the first kind of famous case studies of topic modeling, of machine learning was kind of identifying the true author of Federalist, of one of the unidentified Federalist papers. I forgot the exact nature of that. Maybe someone in the chat remembers. But point being, even relatively crude machine learning, if you have decent training data, is likely able to do this, and the more advanced LLMs can. For quote unquote ordinary people, where you don't have a textual basis to compare it with, I'm for now more optimistic, and I think that's the next question goes in the same direction. I do think, though, that, as with a lot of things AI, we may end up being in a position where we need to more strongly have ethical norms of reuse, right? And so it's certainly conceivable that we get to a point where we feel, okay, we need to put almost all qualitative data behind some sort of light access controls, and then train reusers better ethically, so that the data just don't end up in an AI. But I don't think we're there currently. And I've not seen terribly strong evidence of the ability to use LLMs to re-identify data. Okay, I've answered this. Jessica asks, could you clarify one thing with the controlling access slide? I think you said that the open license would apply just to documentation. At my institution, we are always advised to license all data, even if it's only available upon a request. It's also not possible for us to use open licenses in such cases. Do you license the restrict access data, and do you just come up with custom licenses for the data? Yeah, so we have, the recommendation I have here is to have as few licenses as you can. So we basically have two major custom licenses on QDR. One license is kind of standard access, which is registration only, educational and teach pedagogical use only, no redistribution license. That's a custom license. And then the second one is the controlled access license that has some additional general terms and then has kind of fill in the blank fields where we specify access conditions in. And something along the lines is probably what I would recommend. But you need a license for you, as I think the advice that you're getting there is to license all data is correct, but you don't open license all data. And our licenses are approved by University Council, and probably if you want to have custom licenses, that's the only way to go. You can't just actually come up with your own licenses because, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I assume neither are you. Sadia asks, have you seen examples of researchers working with interviewees individually to negotiate de-identification? Yes. So I'll try. If someone happens to have seen the work on open science and trauma research and can put it in the chat, I'd have to dig through my Zotero. But so that's Susan Campbell and team, and they worked with participants to understand kind of concerns and a protocol for de-identification, and then also had, as part of their general member checking, as a qualitative researcher, I'm kind of ambivalent about member checking as a general procedure, but member checking for de-identification to the extent that participants are interested, I think is perfectly fine. So I've definitely seen that happen. I actually have my own research project where we did detailed researcher interviews, and a couple of those researchers also wanted to review our de-identified transcripts before posting, and I don't have any qualms with that, right? Most people participate in the research because they want to help you. This is not like journalistic interviews where you're worried that politicians are going to take out the parts of the interviews that are going to make them look bad, where there's some concern about should you give them right of approval. That's not how I think about most qualitative research. If people said something that they really, really rather would not have said, my view of qualitative research is, and of research ethics, is that you should let them take it back and take it out. And so working with participants on de-identification is perfectly fine, and in some cases advisable. Again, the literature on member checking that exists says most participants aren't going to care, or they're just going to trust you. So build that in, but for those that do, it can be a good way to go. All right. There are a couple of questions regarding the risk AI models post to de-identification. On a related but slightly different note, whether the current approaches to releasing AI models that are built on qualitative data and could potentially be used to reverse engineer the training data. Yeah, I'm right. The corpus data are typically, a lot of the LLMs are trained on semi-public data, right? That might be copyrighted, but still public data. And there is a couple of them share their training data, right? Like I think the one that's underlying the Llama LLM model that you can actually fully use locally, you can also get the training data. So that's one thing. There is the famous case of or infamous case of the Duke researchers who released an image data set that was obtained under questionable circumstances, right? They put up cameras on the campus and said, you're consenting by walking here, something like that. and they released the data set in full, which, open science, yay, but that's now getting used by all sorts of people, including the Chinese government for facial recognition, which probably less yay. So there are real ethical issues with these very large data sets that I'm honestly not a huge specialist in, but where my sense is that computer science has long pretended that research ethics doesn't exist, and that's now coming to haunt them. I think social scientists, broadly speaking, have been much more attuned to the ethical questions, and I hope that kind of more critical ethical thinking catches up and in AI and computer science. But then, of course, there's also so much money in there that a lot of it happens in the private sector, where different ethical norms reign. All right. I think I answered all of the questions. Is there anything in the chat that I should still look at? Thanks for all this input, by the way. This has been really fun to get so many different questions and input. And that brings me to the end of my presentation. And I think I said Thursday for the ICPSR Forks. Bureau is now going to correct me and say that's tomorrow, right?
Yes, that's right. Our next workshop will be tomorrow.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing my slide and hand it over to Bureau. And the thanks. Again, here's my contact info. Please be in touch, and thanks for all your questions.